2011 levels unless the government makes substantial progress in establishing. Ask for another minute.
Gentleman is granted another minute, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Unless it makes substantial progress in freedom of religion, releasing political prisoners, respecting the rights of journalists, and the bill lays out a whole series of mutually reinforcing steps it must take and the people it must protect. The bill does not prevent increased funding for the Vietnamese government for certain humanitarian assistance, and I want to underscore that, such as food, medicine, Agent Orange remediation, and activities to combat human trafficking. The freeze is on foreign assistance at 2010 levels can be waived if the President determines that increased non-humanitarian aid to Vietnam would promote democracy and freedom or would otherwise be in the national interest. Mr. Chairman, we've passed this bill twice in various forms before by huge majorities. It is time to pass it, and hopefully the Senate will take it up and get it to President Obama. I thank the gentlelady for yielding.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, the chairman of our Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation and Trade of our Committee on Foreign Affairs.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm an original co-sponsor of this bill, H.R. 1410. This is the Vietnam Human Rights Act, and I guess it's no surprise to a lot of us that have followed what has happened in Vietnam. It denies its citizens basic human rights, but here's the problem. The conditions there with respect to abuse of rule of law are getting worse and worse. It used to be that we would watch show trials in terms of the abridgment of rights of the citizens of Vietnam. Now they don't even have the show trials. Now the government just places those dissidents in police detention, and they do it without alerting the family, without alerting anyone. And at that point, you just have to say the rule of law has become non-existent. We received a really stark reminder recently. A human rights dissident, Nguyen Quoc Quan, was arrested by Vietnamese officials. He had attempted to enter the country at Ho Chi Minh City's airport, and the charge that he was held on was terrorism. Terrorism was the original charge. He didn't come to Vietnam equipped with guns or explosives. What's the terrorism charge? Well, he came to Vietnam to meet with other grassroots organizations committed to peaceful discussions on human rights inside the country. And to the Vietnamese communist government, that's terrorism. That really says it all. The case of Nguyen Quoc Quan is not an isolated case here. His treatment there has become the rule, not the exception, for those who are trying to push for some modicum of free speech or religious freedom. And so you have a whole slew of dissidents treated like this, or even worse. And when I say worse, I want to give you another example. Pastor Nguyen Quoc Chin, a pastor of an outlawed Mennonite church. He was recently sentenced to 11 years in prison during a one-day trial for sowing division between the communist government and its citizens. Now, this treatment is nothing new for this particular pastor. To date, he has been aggressively interrogated over 300 times. He has suffered dozens of beatings, and some of us have seen the photographs of the aftermath of some of those brutal beatings. He's been forcefully removed from his residence many times to be thrown in jail. And that is why it is an imperative, my friends, that we pass the Vietnam Human Rights Act. I think the important point here is that this kind of action can be an inspiration to the brave dissidents inside Vietnam who continue to be brutally repressed, because part of this is to provide for information from Radio Free Asia to better be able to broadcast into the country, to better be able to shed light on this kind of activity, to leverage for change, and to bring objective news, to bring the truth, to be a surrogate free radio station to the Vietnamese people. The spread of democratic values in Asia, frankly, is critical to our security interests as well. I myself have met with some of the Vietnamese dissidents discussed here today, and I've been denounced by the Vietnamese government for simply meeting with those whose only wish is freedom to speak their mind. And that tells me that the Vietnamese government is sensitive to international criticism and that the United States must continue to speak out about this issue. I don't think silence is an option for us in the U.S. So in closing, I want to thank Chairman Ros-Lehtinen for her focus on human rights. I want to thank the author here, Chris Smith, for his efforts, and Howard Berman, Congressman from California, for his work on behalf of the Vietnamese people. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Davis.
The gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to express my strong support for H.R. 1410 and also for H.R. 484. These resolutions really embody a great concern of many of my constituents at home as well as Americans across this country. As Americans, we often take for granted the rights and privileges that are guaranteed to each and every individual in this country. So we can speak out at town halls, we can protest in front of the Capitol steps, and when all else fails, we can register our vote at the polls to make our voices heard. Those rights and privileges that we enjoy are being denied every single day to the people of Vietnam. So today we vote on these 2 bills that send a clear message that these abuses will not be tolerated. We must make it clear that progress needs to be made on these issues before we can move forward on other issues that are important to both of our countries, including those issues of trade. Our efforts are aimed at bringing about a brighter future in Vietnam, where citizens are not imprisoned for the songs they write, and individuals are not arrested for carrying books on nonviolent resistance. It's sad, but these remain to be the facts of life for the people of Vietnam. In the words of one of my constituents, we can make a difference if we come together. Let's start by voting yes on House Resolution 1410 and also on the next resolution that we'll be talking about, House Resolution 484. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask Mr. Berman if he has any other requests for time.
I haven't. Mr. Speaker, I thank you for yielding. I have no further requests for time, and if you're prepared to close, I am prepared to relinquish my remaining time. No further requests.
I'm just going to close.
All right, then I will yield back to the balance of my time and urge support for the
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Our nation has always served as a beacon of hope for all who are oppressed and suffer under regimes such as the one in Vietnam, who has shown a blatant disregard for fundamental human rights and universal freedoms. We must continue to serve as such a beacon. We must not waver, Mr. Speaker, in our commitment to standing with the oppressed and not with their oppressors. This bill serves as an important guidepost to have us do that. The Vietnam regime continues its oppression. On August 5th, they arrested about 30 peaceful demonstrators who were protesting China's activities in the South China Sea, including an 81-year-old activist. And the threatened trial of 3 well-known human rights bloggers has been further postponed, thus extending their unjust legal limbo. This human rights legislation is long overdue. It contains a provision prohibiting an increase in non-humanitarian assistance to the government of Vietnam unless certain human rights benchmarks are met. And, of course, it has a presidential waiver, but it authorizes the President to provide assistance through appropriate non-governmental organizations and the Human Rights Defenders Fund for the support of individuals and organizations that are promoting internationally recognized human rights in Vietnam. This is an American principle. This should be a universal principle of human rights and respect for minority rights. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I hope that our colleagues will join us in passing Mr. Smith's bill. Time for it is long overdue. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of our time.
The gentlelady yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1410 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended and the bill is passed. Two, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and agree to H.R. 1464.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1464, a bill to develop a strategy for assisting stateless children from North Korea and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Ross-Layton, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Berman, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I kindly ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to insert extraneous materials into the record on this measure. I thank the Speaker, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Recognized.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 1464, the North Korean Refugee Adoption Act, of which I am a proud co-sponsor. I want to thank my good friend from California, Mr. Royce, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation and Trade on our Foreign Affairs Committee, and a longtime advocate on North Korean human rights and refugee issues for introducing this important bill. We are all too keenly aware of the extreme repression, the malnutrition, and the poverty suffered by so many inside North Korea today. Those threats often take the greatest toll on children. Imagine what happens when a child's natural protectors, parents, are no longer in the picture. And imagine what happens when that child is born or orphaned inside China, when the child lacks legal status or dependable access to social services. Malnutrition, abuse, exploitation, lack of education, these are the horrors that are faced by orphans of North Korean origin who are effectively stateless and without protection. Mr. Speaker, the United States is home to the largest ethnic Korean population outside of Northeast Asia, and many of the nearly 2 million Americans of Korean descent have family ties to North Korea. Numerous American families would like to provide caring homes to these stateless North Korean orphans. H.R. 1464 is a responsible first step toward making that possible. This bill does not ignore the unique challenges involved with ensuring that North Korean adoptees are genuine orphans and not fraudulent victims of trafficking. It does not change U.S. immigration law nor the legal standards for adoption. It does not reduce the need for China to begin abiding by its Refugee Convention obligations to vulnerable North Koreans within its borders. And it does not diminish our commitment to assisting intact refugee families or to reunifying families that are separated. What it does do, Mr. Speaker, is require that our State Department take a broad look at the diplomatic and documentation challenges facing American families who would like to adopt North Korean orphans and report to Congress on potential strategies to address them. Doing the right thing is not always easy. I especially want to applaud those adoptive parents, both past and future, who invest their own lives and homes to provide loving families for some of the world's most endangered children. H.R. 1464 is a welcome step forward, Mr. Speaker, and deserves our unanimous support. And with that, I reserve the balance of our time.
The gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of H.R. 1464. Yield myself as much time as I may consume. I'd like to thank the sponsor of this legislation, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, as well as the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Ms. Ros-Lehtinen, for their leadership on this issue and for their work in supporting the plight of North Korean refugees. Despite North Korea's efforts to appear, quote, strong and prosperous, unquote, this year to celebrate the 100th birthday of the country's founder, vast numbers of its people live in dire conditions. Sadly, the North Korean regime's misguided priorities, pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into its so-called space program, its nuclear programs, and its massive military, only underscore its cold-hearted callousness and blatant disregard for its own citizens. Thousands of North Korean children do not have families to care for them and are threatened with starvation and disease if they remain in North Korea or as refugees in neighboring countries, especially China. Many of the children that have fled the North are in hiding and live in mortal fear of being caught and sent back to North Korea, where they would face severe punishment and even death. Equally terrifying is the prospect of being sold into bondage by human traffickers in China. As a beacon of hope for the rest of the world, the United States must do all it can to help these vulnerable and destitute children. That's why I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of Mr. Royce's legislation, H.R. 1464, the North Korea Refugee Adoption Act. This bill calls on the Secretaries of State and Homeland Security to formulate and report to Congress on a strategy for facilitating the adoption of North Korean children by U.S. citizens. Passage of this bill will be the first step in helping the thousands of North Korean child refugees living alone in foreign lands. And it would provide a glimmer of hope to the American families who would welcome the opportunity to adopt North Korean orphans. The impending passage of this bill speaks to the broad bipartisan consensus in Congress regarding the atrocious human rights situation in North Korea. As innocent men, women, and children flee the repressive North Korean regime at great personal risk, we have a moral obligation to assist them. H.R. 1464 is not merely about adoption, but also an issue of human rights for the North Korean people. We must continue working to ensure that the North Korean people are not forgotten and that orphaned North Korean children will get the care and support they need. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm so pleased to yield 6 minutes to the gentleman from California, the other gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation and Trade, and the author of this important bill.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 6 minutes.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding, and Mr. Speaker, this is the North Korean Refugee Adoption Act of 2011, and I want to thank Chairman Ros-Lehtinen and Ranking Member Berman for their support of this bill. And also, I think we should thank the numerous Korean-American organizations from around this country which tirelessly advocated on behalf of its passage. And they're the groups that originally came to me with the heart-wrenching problem that these orphans face and a suggested idea for a solution. So I would like to recognize the Defense Forum Foundation, the North Korea Freedom Coalition, the Korean Church Coalition for North Korea Freedom, the Korean American Coalition, the Korean Churches for Community Development, 300 Pastoral Coalition, and the 318 Partners. These are the groups that, that suggested that with a lot of hard work, we might get this legislation through. They put through countless phone calls and meetings and rallies up here on Capitol Hill, and I think really helped generate the widespread support that this bill has today. And of course, the bill stems from the problem that for over 50 years, North Korea has been one of the world's most repressive regimes. Every imaginable freedom that we enjoy here, speech or assembly or association or worship, and actually, oddly enough, even the right to smile, is denied in North Korea by one statute or another. Meanwhile, the regime's elites live in luxury. And, of course, the people, especially in the rural areas in North Korea, starve. It is little wonder, then, why tens of thousands of North Koreans, many of them women and children, flee to China. And for many, it's a last resort. It's a final chance to avoid starvation for those children and avoid unspeakable oppression. Yet that choice is not always an easy one. That path to freedom is very perilous. Those fleeing North Korea often make their journey during the winter, and they cross over that Tumen River as it's frozen. And those temperatures there are sub-zero. And the terrain is treacherous. And it is an obstacle course of checkpoints and of informants. And they make that a very dangerous journey. And sadly, but not surprisingly, many refugees succumb to the elements. There are many bodies frozen along that bank. Those that survive also face dangers from human traffickers. As one dissident told National Geographic, crossing the Tumen was easy compared to what happened next, as she was tricked into getting into a car that belonged to a sex trafficker. For the next year, she remained locked in a room, forced into selling her body. The result of all of this is that many North Korean orphans are left in China. Worse yet, they are stateless. They are without identification. Estimates show that thousands of children are left stateless in the border region between North Korea and China, and there they suffer. If they are sent back to North Korea, they suffer unimaginably. Mr. Speaker, this is why we need to pass this legislation. This bill is a good first step in responding to this human rights crisis. And specifically, this bill would have the State Department develop a strategy for assisting stateless children from North Korea. While many American families would welcome the opportunity to adopt a North Korean orphan, many hurdles remain. For example, children must certify that they have lost their parents or legal guardians and that they have absolutely no one to rely on. A child orphan in North Korea would have a very hard time proving that attestation. Most of these children have great difficulty proving this to their own understanding. And they have no death certificate of parents, and many have no proof that they're truly orphans. So by passing this bill, we will be taking an important step toward solving these problems. We are not committing to any particular policies, but we are committing to doing what we can to help these defenseless children. We are trying to create a win-win for these desperate young ones, orphans living in deplorable conditions, and their potential new families. And again, I thank you, Chairman Ross-Lehtinen. I thank you for your support, and we thank the numerous Korean-American organizations, and we thank Ranking Member Berman for all of this help, and I urge my colleagues to support this important bill and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I have no further requests for time, and in order to allow the majority to close, I will yield back the balance of my time and urge support for the legislation.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think Mr. Royce did a wonderful job in summing up our bipartisan position, and with that, I yield back the balance of our time.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1464? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended and the bill is passed to, and without objection, the motion is to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 484 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 484, resolution calling on the government of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam to respect basic human rights and cease abusing vague national security provisions such as Articles 79 and 88 of the Vietnamese Penal Code, which are often the pretext to arrest and detain citizens who peacefully advocate for religious and political freedom.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Ros-Lehtinen, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Berman, each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to insert extraneous material into the record on this measure.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of House Resolution 484, a bipartisan resolution of Loretta Sanchez, a bill of which I am a co-sponsor. This resolution calls on the Vietnamese authorities to respect basic human rights and cease abusing vague national security provisions such as Articles 70 and 88 of the Vietnamese Penal Code. These draconian legal measures are often used to arrest and detain citizens who peacefully advocate for religious and political freedom. When the Bush administration signed the bilateral trade agreement with Vietnam in the year 2006, which paved the way for Vietnam's joining the World Trade Organization the next year, the Congress was assured that trade liberalization with Hanoi would lead inevitably to political liberalization. This proved, however, to be as spurious as a promise as one made by the Clinton administration, which vowed that the liberalization of trade would open the door to democracy and human rights in China. The siren song, "The trade is the panacea for ending totalitarian oppression," is directly contradicted by reports of deteriorating human rights conditions in both Vietnam and China. And as Hanoi comes increasingly to Washington, seeking strategic support for its dispute with the Chinese in the South China Sea, one can only ask, why are we not using Hanoi's concerns in the South China Sea as leverage to win greater concessions on the dismal human rights positions in Vietnam? Why would we even consider helping Vietnam against Chinese bullying as long as Hanoi holds behind bars United States citizen Dr. Quan? Dr. Quan is a mathematician, and he has been detained in Vietnam since he returned there for a family visit in April. This resolution spells out in great detail how Hanoi makes use of the security provisions contained in Articles 79 and 88 to continue to detain such noted democracy advocates as Father Lee. Article 88's provision regarding propaganda against the state gives Hanoi great leeway in detaining and imprisoning human rights activists, writers, and those who advocate for democracy, journalists, Internet bloggers, the list goes on. The repeal of Articles 79 and 88 and the release of all political prisoners, as called for in this important resolution, would represent first steps away from the continued totalitarian oppression of the Vietnamese regime. Our State Department should not put concern for human rights and protection of the rights of U.S. citizens on a back burner while we pursue commercial and strategic opportunities with the leaders in Hanoi. We in Washington must be of one voice in strongly condemning the continuing crackdown on human rights and democracy in Vietnam. We should also remember that without the rule of law, it is not only democracy advocates who are put at risk, but also those whose commercial contracts will prove to be worthless pieces of paper. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to give their strong and unwavering support for this resolution, and with that, I reserve the balance of our time.
The gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 1410 as amended. Yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
I apologize. It's H.Res. 484. First, I want to thank the sponsor of the legislation, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Loretta Sanchez, for her entire time in this Congress. She has been an eloquent, passionate, and effective spokesperson on behalf of the Vietnamese people and their right to have their political, individual, and religious rights. Same goes for the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Ms. Ross-Lehtinen, who on all human rights issues has been a true congressional leader. This resolution calls on Vietnam's government to respect basic human rights for its people and to support using vague national security laws as a pretext to arrest and detain citizens who peacefully advocate for religious and political freedom. This resolution demonstrates America's commitment to human rights, democracy, and the rule of law by calling on the government of Vietnam to release all political prisoners, including activists, writers, and bloggers who have been unfairly detained or sentenced. The names of over 40 of these political dissidents and activists who were peacefully expressing their views and posed no threat to Vietnam's national security are included in this resolution. Vietnam must stop criminalizing free speech and peaceful political activism and begin upholding the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights to which it is a signatory. As ties between the U.S. and Vietnam continue to develop and mature, Hanoi must understand that respect for the universal principles of democracy, freedom, and human rights remains a central part of our bilateral relationship. And more progress in these areas is needed before, as we have said before, that relationship can be taken to the next level. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to my good friend from California, Mr. Royce, the chairman of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute, I think I heard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support. As Human Rights Watch noted, last year saw a steady stream of political trials and arrests, likely spurred in part by Vietnamese government concerns that pro-democracy Arab Spring movements might reach Asia. As they explain, there's at least 24 convictions right now under Article 79 and Article 88 of the Penal Code that have been handed down, hence the need for this resolution to pass this chamber. We should all support it, and I yield back.
And yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to yield for such time as she may consume to the sponsor of this resolution, the gentlelady from California, Ms.
The gentlelady from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to Chairwoman Ross-Lehtinen and to Ranking Member Berman and to the committee for bringing this resolution to the House floor. Mr. Speaker, Dr. Nguyen Quoc Quan is a democracy activist, and he's also a member of a democracy activist organization here called Viet Thanh. On April 17th of this year, an American citizen, yes, Dr. Nguyen is an American citizen, was arrested at Saigon Airport by the Vietnamese authorities, and he was charged with terrorism. And what for? Terrorism for 4 months. For possessing educational documents on leadership skills and on nonviolent political activism. How can possession of educational documents be considered terrorism? Last month, the Vietnamese government decided to change Dr. Nguyen's crime from terrorism to subversion, despite having no grounds for either one of those two things. Democracy activists such as Paulus Lê Sung, Ho Dequan, Deng Xuang Zhu, and all of the above have been detained. They've been detained under an Article 79, which penalizes carrying out activities aimed at overthrowing the People's Administration. When you're charged with Article 79 in Vietnam, it carries a maximum of the death penalty. Father Nguyen Van Ly, Nguyen Van Hai, more commonly known as blogger Du Kai, and Phan Tan Hai are all charged, for example, with Article 88, which penalizes conducting propaganda against the state, and that carries a maximum sentence of 12 years. So what does House Resolution do? It addresses these very vague national security provisions, and it calls on the government of Vietnam to cease abusing provisions such as Article 79 and 88, using those articles to arrest peaceful democracy advocates, I believe, is blatant human rights violations. Vietnam is a signatory to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil Rights and Political Rights. However, Vietnam has yet to become a responsible member of our international community. And consequently, the Vietnamese government has denied its citizens the freedoms of religion, of opinion, of speech, of assembly, of the right to counsel, of a fair trial. How does this government expect to gain the respect of the international community when they refuse to treat their citizens with the same respect? House Resolution 484 condemns the government of Vietnam for its continued crackdown against democracy activists and calls on Vietnam to repeal Articles 79 and 88. It also calls for the release of all political prisoners, writers, and bloggers who the only thing they've asked is to have a more open process, to have some civil rights, to have some human rights, to be able to discuss with each other a new way forward. As Americans, we pride ourselves on being a country that stands by freedom, by liberty, and by justice. And as Americans, as members of this United States Congress, we have a responsibility. Other countries are watching us. We have a responsibility to stand up and to take steps and to say enough is enough. As the government of Vietnam continues to criminalize individual rights, as it criminalizes basic freedoms, I believe that this is an indication that Vietnam is not interested in being a responsible member of the international community. We, the United States, need to examine our economic and our military relationships with Vietnam. We must insist on changes to human rights in that country. And I urge my colleagues to vote for House Resolution 484 to protect the rights and the freedoms of the citizens of Vietnam. But in doing so, we protect the rights and the freedoms of every citizen in this world. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I continue to reserve. I wanted to know if the gentleman is going to yield
Yes,
back.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further requests for time, and I'm prepared, if you are prepared to close, to yield back the balance of my time, and will yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just in closing, I would hope that some of these impassioned speakers on behalf of respect for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law for the people of Vietnam, as meritorious as they are, that I hope that they're extended to my native homeland of Cuba one day as well. Thank you. May we hear those voices on the House floor calling for those same characteristics for the people of Cuba. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of our time.
The gentlelady yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 484 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The resolution is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and agree to Senate Concurrent Resolution 17.
The clerk will report the title of the concurrent resolution.
Senate Concurrent Resolution 17, concurrent resolution expressing the sense of Congress that Taiwan should be accorded observer status in the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Ross-Layton, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Berman, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida.
I thank the Speaker, and I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to insert extraneous material into the record on this measure.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with that, I would like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, who has a strong interest in this issue related to Taiwan's status in the International Civil Aviation Organization.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentlelady for yielding, and I do rise in support of this measure. For too long, Taiwan has been left out of international organizations at the demand of China. Taiwan was denied access to the World Health Organization, unable to participate as even an observer for over 40 years. Thankfully, though, that changed in 2009 when a Taiwanese delegation was allowed to observe meetings in Geneva. Infectious disease knows no borders, and it was only proper that change was made. Well, Congress had long pressed for this action through bills and resolutions, so it is fitting that we once again take to the floor to press for Taiwan's inclusion in the International Civil Aviation Organization. Despite being home to the world's 18th busiest airport, Taiwan has been kept out of an organization that aims to keep passengers safe. Indeed, as this resolution finds, Taiwan's exclusion from the ICAO has impeded Taiwan's government from keeping up to date with aviation standards and prevented the implementation of new systems and new procedures. The 35 million passengers that travel to and from Taiwan each year are done a great disservice by Taiwan's exclusion. Mr. Speaker, in a relatively short period of time, Taiwan has gone from poverty to prosperity. It has gone from autocracy to democracy. We have a strong relationship that stretches back for over half a century. Today, our relations remain strong. Passage of this resolution will only serve to strengthen this relationship, and I urge my colleagues to support this measure. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
We reserve the balance of our time.
Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of Senate Con Resolution 17 and yield myself as much time as I may consume. I'd like to thank the sponsor of the legislation, the Senator from New Jersey, Mr. Menendez, and the Chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Ms. Ross-Layton, for their leadership on this issue. This resolution expresses the sense of Congress that Taiwan should be accorded observer status in the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO. Taiwan has made significant progress in its economic and political development. Today, Taiwan is a leading trade partner of the United States and stands as a beacon of democracy in Asia. However, Taiwan has been excluded from meaningful participation in ICAO, an international organization which is dedicated to ensuring safe and efficient air transportation around the globe. Taiwan clearly deserves to be brought into ICAO as an observer, a status specifically recognized under ICAO's own rules. Taiwan has jurisdiction over airspace comprising 176,000 square nautical miles, provides air traffic control services to over 1.3 million flights each year. It has the 8th largest airport in the world by cargo volume, the 18th largest by the number of international passengers. Taiwan's exclusion from ICAO has impeded Taiwan's efforts to maintain civil aviation standards that keep up with rapidly evolving international standards. It is unable to even contact ICAO for up-to-date information on aviation standards and norms, nor can it receive ICAO's technical assistance implementing new regulations or participate in ICAO technical and academic seminars. Despite these impediments, Taiwan has made every effort to comply with ICAO standards, but their continued exclusion not only hurts Taiwan, it puts the entire international aviation system at risk. Indeed, Taiwan's exclusion has prevented ICAO from developing a truly global strategy to address security threats. With this resolution, Congress calls on the international community to grant Taiwan observer status at ICAO, not only to help Taiwan, but to ensure ICAO can fulfill its own mission and address international threats to aviation security. We call on the United States government to take a leading role at ICAO to assist Taiwan in gaining that status and look forward to working with our administration officials to track the development of these efforts. I urge my colleagues to support the resolution, and I will yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I will make some remarks, and then I will also yield back the remainder of our time. And, Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, sir. And I rise in strong support of this important resolution, which calls upon the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, to grant meaningful participation for Taiwan. Is there any doubt in a post-September 11th world that air traffic safety constitutes one of the first lines of defense against those who would do harm to the United States or to our friends and allies? Are not the people of Taiwan deserving of the same level of protection against air assault as provided to the other peoples whose governments participate in ICAO? The Taipei Flight Information Region, under the jurisdiction of Taiwan, covers an airspace of 176,000 square nautical miles. Taiwan's main international airport is recognized as the 8th largest in the world in cargo traffic and the 18th in the number of international passengers who make use of its services. Can there be any doubt, therefore, that Taiwan, which provides air safety control services for well over 1,350,000 flights annually, needs meaningful participation in an international organization responsible for air safety and security? Beijing, like some haughty overlord, condescendingly informed Taipei and the UN system in the year 2009 that it would allow, at least temporarily, Taiwan's participation in the World Health Assembly. Meaningful participation in international organizations for Taiwan represents too important an issue to be determined only by the whims of Beijing. It is time to open the door to Taiwan's constructive and meaningful participation in ICAO, and that time is now. The State Department, as this resolution suggests, should assume a leading role in providing an action plan to ensure that this happens as quickly as possible. We owe this, Mr. Speaker, to the people of Taiwan. We owe this to ensure as well to the air safety of those American passengers flying over the skies of the Western Pacific. And here I am not speaking just in theoretical terms, Mr. Speaker. Let us not forget that it was less than 3 decades ago when, due to a tragic confusion in air communications, a Soviet military fighter shot down a Korean Airlines civilian flight as it left Western Pacific and flew inadvertently over Soviet territory. As we know, this resulted in the deaths of all 269 people on board, including a member of this House, Congressman Larry McDonald of Georgia's 7th District. The congressman was traveling to Seoul to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the United States-South Korea Mutual Defense Treaty. So air safety control is therefore a very serious matter. Taiwan needs meaningful participation in ICAO, not only for the safety and security in the air of its own citizens, but also for all of the peoples of the vibrant Asia-Pacific region. ICAO will be holding its 12th Air Navigations Conference in November, and Taiwan should be, must be, represented there in Montreal. So, Mr. Speaker, I urge that my colleagues join Mr. Berman and me in expressing their overwhelming support for this important resolution. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and with that, I yield back the balance of our time.
The gentlelady yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to Senate Concurrent Resolution 17? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the concurrent resolution is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The Chair lays before the House the following communication.
The Honorable, the Speaker, House of Representatives. Sir, this is to notify you formally, pursuant to Rule 8 of the Rules of the House of Representatives, that I have been served with a subpoena for documents issued by the Fairfax County Circuit Court in connection with civil litigation currently pending before that court. After consultation with the Office of General Counsel, I have determined that compliance with the subpoena is inconsistent with the privileges and precedents of the House. Signed sincerely, Daniel L. Scandling, Chief of Staff.
The Chair lays before the House a communication.
The Honorable, the Speaker, House of Representatives. Sir, this is to notify you formally, pursuant to Rule 8 of the Rules of the House of Representatives, that I have been served with a subpoena for documents issued by the Fairfax County Circuit Court in connection with civil litigation currently pending before that court. After consultation with the Office of General Counsel, I have determined that compliance with the subpoena is inconsistent with the privileges and precedents of the House. Best wishes, signed sincerely, Frank R. Wolf, Member of Congress.
The Chair lays before the House the following personal request.
Leave of absence requested for Ms. Napolitano of California for today.
Without objection, the request is granted. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend our remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to congratulate the City of Richmond, Texas, for its 175th anniversary. There would not be a state of Texas without Richmond. In 1822, members of Stephen F. Austin's Old 300 built a fort on a bend in the Brazos River. Stephen F. Austin is known as the father of Texas. He built his colony around that fort, where Richmond sits today. In the wake of Texas independence, Richmond was incorporated by the Republic of Texas as Fort Bend County's seat of government in 1836. Richmond's current iconic mayor, Hilmer Moore, is the longest-serving mayor in American history, serving the people of Richmond since 1949. Historically a center of commerce, the heart of an early livestock industry, and a powerhouse of natural resources, the city continues to be something its people are darn proud of. It's an honor to share that pride with the people of Richmond, Texas. Congratulations on our 175th anniversary. I yield back.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomer, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 11 years ago today, the worst attack in American history on American soil occurred. More loss of life than Pearl Harbor. It was a day that those of us who are alive and old enough to know what was happening will never forget. It was a day of commitment as well, that we would do whatever was necessary to protect our country, that we would do whatever was necessary to prevent future such attacks from occurring. And I recall there in East Texas, where I live, where I was a judge at the time, the day after, on September 12, 2001, was an extraordinary day as well. It was a day that I also will not forget. I'd never seen communities come together as we did across America on September 12, 2001. Not in my lifetime. In World War II, from history, I've read accounts about some in America that felt like war with Germany was a bad idea, that we ought to be nice to them. And there were even people that were divided in America back then. But the overall resolve was to protect democracy, make democracy safe, make the world safe for democracy was the slogan. But we were so united on September 12, 2001. There in Tyler, Texas, and I know it happened all over East Texas. Same way. People came together. It didn't matter what race anyone was. It didn't matter where they came from, their national origin. Man, woman, religious preference didn't matter. We came together as one people. There were no hyphenated Americans that day. No Anglo-Americans, African-Americans, Asian-Americans. We were Americans. And we stood united. And we wept together. And we prayed together. And we held hands and sang together. Here in Washington, D.C., once again today, we sang God Bless America without regard to party, without regard to House, Senate. I think there was less mention of the word God today. I'm grateful for Speaker Pelosi, who at the end of her remarks asked for God to bless and comfort those who lost loved ones on 9/11 and asked that God would still bless America. And I'm grateful she did that. Other leaders did not. Andrew McCarthy was the prosecutor of those who were involved in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. He's a man that understands the Constitution. He understands the law. He is a fantastic prosecutor, a brilliant mind.
and a great writer. And I won't read the entire article, but it's an article worth noting from Andrew C. McCarthy entitled Remembering 9/11, at least for a day. He says, "It is difficult to say what's harder to believe. That is, that it has been 11 years since the 9/11 atrocities, or that national security has become an irrelevant issue in the most consequential presidential election in decades. The first observation reminds us that today is a day of remembrance of the loss of nearly 3,000 of our fellow citizens, of the bravery of those who willingly gave their lives to save others, and of the heroism of the men and women who put on the line all that they have. That includes the love and well-being of their families, on whom the burden of American national security has been imposed while the rest of us go on with our lives, too often without giving them a first thought, never mind a second. No matter which political party has been in power since 9/11, there has been a great deal of bloviating about the rule of law. It is as if we had evolved beyond anything so crude and benighted as armed force and national interest, especially national defense. Let's remember today that we have the luxury of living under something resembling the rule of law only because dedicated Americans sacrifice themselves to confront evil. In this case, the adherents of an evil ideology, Islamic supremism, that is closer to the law of the jungle. And for those who do not understand this, I'm saying this parenthetically, it's not in the article, Islamic supremism is not talking about all of those who worship and follow Islam and Islamic teachings. We have friends around the world who do not want to live under totalitarian, radical Islamic supremism, such as the Taliban, such as Al-Qaeda. They don't want to live under that, and they're Muslims. They want to live their lives. They want to worship in their own religion without totalitarians telling them how they must. Unfortunately, as in Afghanistan, those Muslim friends, and Pakistan for that matter, Iran and Iraq as well, there are Muslims who have admired the United States until we abandoned them. Going back to Andrew McCarthy's article, the rule of law, he says, has precious little to do with why we have gotten through 11 years without a reprise of 9/11. A better explanation is that terrorists who have been captured or killed cannot commit more terrorism. I'll insert parenthetically, there are terrorists who were captured, some confined at Guantanamo Bay, some confined at other facilities, who have been released and who have been found again on the battlefield killing Americans. They were captured, prevented from enacting further terrorism, and then released under some false notion that that would win friends and influence people, only to have other Americans killed by these same thugs. Back to Andrew McCarthy's article. He says, on the matter of evil, it is good to remember that it exists. Evil is not a misunderstanding, a cultural gaffe, or a natural reaction to political policies adopted in pursuit of American interests or Israeli self-defense. That brings us to the second observation. The fact that national security concerns are absent from the 2012 campaign, even with tens of thousands of Americans at arms in distant hellholes, even with tens of millions of Americans enduring the increasingly overbearing government that has been the cost of heightened vigilance in an era where barbarism is met with political correctness. The United States defeated the ideological threats of the 20th century because we were unafraid to see evil for what it was, to diagnose it and to understand it. Today we ignore it. We rationalize it and assume we are somehow to blame for it. For the bipartisan ruling class, 9/11 is about violent extremism. As if irrational, wanton killers seized by a psychological disorder committed mass murder for no better reason than to visit on the world's most famous office buildings the most shocking case of workplace violence in history. The violent extremism narrative is nonsensical. It defies reality as well as history, but it's a convenient fiction. It miniaturizes the enemy. With the killing of bin Laden, the President can now portray the enemy as defeated, even as al-Qaeda resurges. Even as Iraq has become an Iranian-influenced Sharia state that works against the United States and Israel. He says parenthetically, remember when victory was defined as a stable democracy that is a reliable ally, close parenthesis. And even as Afghan Islamists turn their weapons on their American trainers, and the administration pleads with the Taliban to negotiate, he says, remember when victory was defined as a stable democracy that prevents the Taliban from returning and giving safe haven to al-Qaeda again? The violent extremism canard allows the administration to declare victory even as we are being humiliated. That's an excerpt from Andrew McCarthy's article regarding today. You know, Mr. Speaker, it is tragic that around the world the United States has had allies who trusted us, who put their security in our hands, even to the extent of losing political power, losing political office, like some of the Polish leaders who trusted America to help them with a missile defense. Wasn't so much a defense against Russia, was concern for potential missiles in the Middle East that this nation has not done enough to stop. But those who staked their political careers on the trustworthiness of the United States came up empty in Poland. Mubarak had agreements with this administration, met with this administration. Gaddafi had agreements with this administration, met with them, talked. We had senators from both sides of the aisle although one of our Republican senators says he didn't send that message. It wasn't his tweet, he says now, that he was meeting with Gaddafi and that he was an interesting man. But regardless, we know that there were people from both sides of the aisle that met with Gaddafi. Because Gaddafi, after President Bush gave the order to invade Iraq, Gaddafi believed he was next if he didn't do something and end his nuclear proliferation. So he did. He became an ally, even though he was a murderer with blood on his hands. He reached agreements. He promised he would not attack Americans again. And once again, someone who trusted an agreement with the United States came up short. Some of our allies in other parts of the world and other countries have to be wondering if they're next. I've visited with leaders in other countries who say the Chinese are constantly coming around saying, have you figured out yet that you can't really trust the United States to keep their agreements? Hey, you can trust us. Well, whenever you come around, including in Israel, there are Chinese constantly there saying, when you figure out you can't trust the United States, we're ready to be your friend, your ally. There should be no better ally in the world than the United States. But we have different administrations, and different administrations are better about keeping their words with allies than others. The Northern Alliance in Afghanistan fought with us and for us to defeat the Taliban by early 2002. Over the years, they have buried family and friends who have been our co-fighters against radical Islamists in Afghanistan. We abandoned them. This administration does not want to talk to them. And I was told by some of the Northern Alliance leaders earlier this year that one of the leaders of the Taliban that this administration released for humanitarian purposes ended up announcing he's back leading the Taliban as one of their leaders, and he announced on Afghan national television that under Sharia law, if anyone in Afghanistan had not been supportive of the Taliban in the past, they need to come in and ask forgiveness and get the Taliban's protection. Because as the leader said, told people who watched the national television channel in Afghanistan, that everybody in the world knows the United States has lost in Afghanistan, and so all they have to do is wait till 2014 when this president has promised the United States will be out, and they'll be back in charge. And certainly President Karzai apparently has enough fear of them that he's giving them an awful lot of freedom and control in the area. Regardless of what anyone may say or prove about President Karzai, he's not stupid. He knows we won't be there to keep him protected. So it looks as if he may be trying to placate the Taliban. Why wouldn't he? The United States sure is. And I hear friends here on the floor talk about the lessons of Vietnam. The lesson of Vietnam is not that it was an unwinnable war. That's very clear. If we had carpet bombed, and this came from one of the leaders at the Hanoi Hilton, as he told Sam Johnson, as the Americans left the Hanoi Hilton, including John McCain. But Sam says one of the most ruthless leaders was laughing, "You stupid Americans," because we had just carpet bombed them for 2 weeks after they walked out of the Paris peace talks. So, "You stupid Americans, don't you know if you had just bombed us for 1 more week, we would have had to surrender unconditionally?" This nation owes an apology to those who were sent to fight in Vietnam for leaving them over there to fight without an order to win and come home. That should be the lesson of Vietnam. I was shocked to hear from parents of one of the SEAL Team 6 members that was killed on Chinook. Billy and Karen Vaughn were the first ones to mention it. I'm embarrassed I didn't know. They said 2/3 of the Americans killed in Afghanistan have been killed under President Obama as the commander-in-chief. I found that hard to believe. So we got the numbers directly from the Department of Defense. And I've got a poster here. President Bush ordered Americans at war or to go fight in Afghanistan. We knew when we found out that's where terrorists were trained, where the plot was supposedly hatched to kill thousands of American innocent victims. So we have a list from the Department of Defense, their own Statistical Information Analysis Division, and you look at the number of American deaths of our fantastic men and women in Afghanistan, and from October in 2001 through the end of December 2008, there were 625 American casualties, Americans killed. Valiant, brave men and women of our armed services killed in Afghanistan, every one of them a treasure. But when we get down to the just over 3.5 years since, in the war that candidate Obama called the good war, a term I don't know of anybody who's ever been in the military would use about a war, but he called it the good war. Well, in President Obama's good war, though he has been commander-in-chief less than half the time of President Bush, it isn't 2/3. 70% of American military men and women who've been killed in Afghanistan have been under the command of Commander-in-Chief Obama. And it gets worse when you look at the total wounded in action. During the 7 years and 3 months that President Bush was president, or was Commander-in-Chief over the war in Afghanistan, 2,638 precious American men and women were wounded. When you visit our incredible men and women who have been wounded, lost arms, legs, severely disabled, you end up walking away being the one who's uplifted with the incredible American spirit and the spirit of our American men and women. They're such a blessing. But not to the extent that you would think that anyone in America would want to leave our military men and women in Afghanistan without a clear purpose, without rules of engagement that lets them defend themselves. We'll be talking more about that in the days to come. But in the just over 3.5 years that the Afghan war has been under command of Commander-in-Chief Obama, as compared to the 2,638 precious American men and women who were wounded during half the time approximately this president has been in command, over 14,817, or 84% of the men and women who have been wounded in Afghanistan. Now, we have fantastic leaders in Afghanistan, some of our nation's best. But when you get out into the field and you talk to the men and women, sometimes you get a little different story. There's a poll that came out last week indicating massive lack of morale among our military men and women in Afghanistan. How could there not be? They've been told they're going to have to stay in Afghanistan. We're going to be there for 2 more years or so. They don't have a clear mission. Basically, train people that may kill you during or after the training. You're not allowed, under the rules of engagement, to properly defend yourself. And then our men and women in our armed forces are supposed to hope and pray that they're not one of the last ones killed on the way out. I would have thought people would understand the lesson of Vietnam. Not that there are wars such as Vietnam or Afghanistan that are not winnable. Vietnam was winnable. Afghanistan initially was won. We took the eye off the ball. President Obama did inherit a terrible situation in Afghanistan, and then he has doubled down, more than doubled down, on the men and women who have been sacrificed, giving their lives, their arms, their legs in service to this country. We should not allow those precious men and women's lives to go without proper consideration. So many in our military have stepped up and said, I will go, I will defend America. I called after 9/11. I was told I was too old. I said, I've got friends that I was in the Army with years ago. They're still in. They said, yes, that's because they were still in. And if you had stayed in, you could still be in. But you're too old to go back now. So though I was too old to go back into the Army that I'd served 4 years of my life in, I found another place of service. And I have to speak on behalf of our men and women in our military. And I have to beg, Mr. Speaker, that our leaders in Washington, in particular the leader, the Commander-in-Chief, either give our military a proper mission or get them out of Afghanistan. Give them proper rules of engagement or get them out now. Don't make them sit around for 2 years wondering if they're going to be the next ones that leave in a casket. Let them win and come home, or bring them home now. They can win. They're that good. With Pakistan, I kept talking to people that say, you know, most of the supplies are coming from Pakistan to supply the Taliban. Then cut off the supplies. We have the ability to do that. We just haven't had the will. Either develop the will, cut off the supplies to the Taliban, cut them off, or bring our people home now. Don't let one more American lose an arm, a leg, both arms, both legs, or come home another death. Give them the orders to defeat the Taliban. Come hell or high water, do it now, and then come home or bring them home now. We owe them that much. Is it any wonder the suicide rate is so high? So, how are we treating our allies on this, the 11th anniversary of 9/11? From the Israeli media, Haaretz, comes this report today. I'll read it verbatim. The White House declined Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's request on Tuesday to meet U.S. President Barack Obama during a UN conference in New York at the end of the month. And parenthetically, I will insert, this is the same president who has told the Taliban, look, we'll buy you offices in Qatar. We'll let the rest of your murdering thugs out of confinement if you'll just sit down and talk to us. But apparently the president's schedule just doesn't allow a meeting with what has been a phenomenal ally, believer in the value of life and liberty in Israel. The article goes on. An official in Jerusalem said the Prime Minister's office sent the White House a message stating that although Netanyahu will spend only 2.5 days on U.S. soil, he is interested in meeting with Obama and is willing to travel to the U.S. Capitol specifically for that purpose. The official added that the White House rejected the request and said at this time Obama's schedule does not allow for a meeting. The White House's response marks a new low in relations between Netanyahu and Obama, underscored by the fact that this is the first time Netanyahu will visit the U.S. as Prime Minister without meeting the President. Israeli Defense Minister Ehud Barak reportedly tried smoothing things over, but Bibi, or Prime Minister Netanyahu, is having none of it. Quote, the world tells Israel, wait, there's still time. And I say, wait for what? Wait until when? Those in the international community who refuse to put red lines before Iran don't have a moral right to place a red light before Israel. Unquote. Netanyahu told reporters on Tuesday. Quote, now if Iran knows that there is no red line, if Iran knows there is no deadline, what will it do? Exactly what it's doing. It's continuing without any interference towards obtaining nuclear weapons capability and from there, nuclear bombs, unquote, he said. Relations between the U.S. and Israel have been strained during the entire Obama term. Obama's call for Israel to retreat to its 1967 borders was widely seen as a slap to our ally. Obama's support for ousting the late Hosni Mubarak from the Egyptian presidency paved the way for what now looks like an Islamist takeover in Cairo, endangering long-standing peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. President Obama has also not visited Israel during his presidency. Republican presidential nominee Mitt Romney visited Israel July 2012. More news today. This from Mohammed Abu Zaid with the AP, dated September 11, 2012. Egyptian demonstrators climbed the walls of the U.S. Embassy in Cairo today and pulled down the American flag to protest a film that they say is insulting to the Prophet Muhammad. There's an update at 2:07 p.m. Eastern Time. CNN reports that U.S. security guards fired a volley of warning shots as the crowd gathered outside the embassy walls. CNN adds that the embassy has been expecting a demonstration and cleared all diplomatic personnel earlier from the facility. The original post said from the AP, or the Associated Press reports that embassy officials say there was no staff inside at the time. Reuters reports that protesters tried to raise a black flag carrying the slogan, quote, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger," unquote. The news agency says about 2,000 protesters had gathered outside the embassy and about 20 have scaled the walls. The AP says the protesters were largely ultra-conservative Islamists. Iran Fars news agency says the protest is aimed at a movie being produced by a group of extremist members of the Egyptian Coptic Church in the United States. Parenthetically, I will mention we've seen in recent days that this new government in Egypt, that the United States has to bear partial responsibility for being in place, has now seen the return of crucifixions in Egypt. The barbaric manner of killing people by making them suffer as much as possible before they breathe their last, just as Jesus himself did in laying down his life for others. Also, it is remarkable that you have people who say, as they did with the insulting cartoon of depicting a Muhammad or someone appearing to be situated that way as a violent person, and in response there were riots and people were killed, which kind of seems to make it not a cartoon but a prophecy. Back at the article. CNN says the film in question is a Dutch production. The AP says clips of the film are available on YouTube and show the prophet, and this would clearly be insulting, having sexual relations and question his role as the messenger of God's words. Of course that would be insulting. It's ridiculous to have anything that resembles that, just as it is absolutely ridiculous and despicable to demean Christianity, to call it a hate group when it's founded by Jesus, who showed the ultimate love for all humanity. It's despicable when someone burns a flag, but it's not illegal. It's not illegal to burn a Bible. It's despicable, but it's not illegal. Yet, personally, I anticipate if history shows what the radicals will do, they will follow the example. Unfortunately, there will be more rioting. Somebody will tragically be killed by these cutthroats. And then some will say, see, we need to change the law in America where you can burn Bibles, you can burn the flag, you can desecrate any religion, just not Islam. And then the goal is found in the archives after a search warrant showed one of the 10-year goals to be subjecting our Constitution to Sharia law. and that will be a box that can be checked off. Back to the article. After the protest, the U.S. Embassy issued this statement on its website. The Embassy of the United States in Cairo condemns the continuing efforts by misguided individuals to hurt the religious feelings of Muslims, as we condemn efforts to offend believers of all religions. How about the Christians in Egypt that are being barbarically killed for their religious beliefs? Wouldn't it be nice if this administration would condemn those activities and do what it takes to stop them? Today, the 11th anniversary of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on the United States, Americans are honoring our patriots and those who serve our nation as the fitting response to the enemies of democracy. Respect for religious beliefs is a cornerstone of American democracy. We firmly reject the actions by those who abuse the universal right of free speech to hurt the religious beliefs of others. The Grand Mufti of Egypt, Sheikh Ali Gourmet, strongly condemned the movie. Freedom of speech does not warrant desecrating sanctities, Gourmet said in a statement Sunday. And he's right. But those freedoms exist in America. The old adage that was attributed to Voltaire for most of the history since, including during the Revolution, I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it, used to mean something in this country. Now, it's been subjected to ideological terms that would have it say more something on the order of, I disagree with what you say, so I want you imprisoned, I want you to lose your business, I want you to have no friends, I want to take all your money, I want to destroy your life. What a turn over the last 200 plus years from our Constitution's establishment and writing in 1787. Of course, it took longer than that to be ratified. 11 years after 9/11, what has gone wrong? You know, not only were there mistakes in Vietnam under both Democratic and Republican presidents, our embassy was attacked in Tehran in 1979. Those of us at Fort Benning, I didn't know of anybody that was dying to go, but I knew an awful lot of people willing to go and die in defense of our country. And under everybody's definition of international law, when you attack an embassy, you have committed an act of war against that country. And if the host country cannot protect the embassy, then that country who owns that embassy, that uses that embassy, has every right to bring the full military power to bear to defend it. And I still carry the horrible realization. I believe if we had defended our embassy in 1979, thousands and thousands and thousands of precious Americans would not have had to give their lives since. Our embassy has been attacked in Egypt. If the government that Secretary of State has just promised $2.5 billion, I don't know, some of it may have already gone over there. If they're not going to be able to defend our embassy, then we need to take action to defend it. I also think it's time to revisit the Carter-era idea that we should never take out government leaders. I think it's time to have this debate again. Which is more immoral to go to war with a country where at the time you go to war, most of the people of that country like you and respect you, and yet are going to die, many of them? Or to take a position, look, it's your country, you're free to establish whatever government you want, but if you put in place a government that declares war on the United States, that says we are for the annihilation of the United States, their way of life, their people, then we will take that government out. And we won't rebuild it. You'll be free to pick whatever kind of government you want. It's time to have the debate. Wouldn't that have been better in Afghanistan rather than forcing a centralized government on a tribal region that has since become so corrupt that the money that we have spent by the billions in Afghanistan, given to Afghanistan, has made its way to other places besides the intended objects. Talking to some of our soldiers over there who have trained farmers, but they said the billions that have been spent and sent to Afghanistan to create farming projects had not any of it made it to the region where they were training the farmers. It was wasted effort, so they travel around over there wondering, will they be the next IED death, or will they be the next IED dismembered? The thing is, a good foreign policy says the enemy of our enemy is our friend. A good foreign policy says we will not try to buy off the bullies in the world to make them like us. As I've said for years, you don't have to pay people to hate you. They'll do it for free. Save that money. Use it to rebuild relations with former allies that have been let down. But don't keep giving money to people that hate us. We don't need to be nation building. We need to let nations live in peace under their own discretion. But if they declare war or set as a goal our annihilation, shouldn't we at least talk about taking out the government rather than going to war with the people? I think it's time to have the debate again. There is too much death and loss of life in Afghanistan. Hard to believe, 70% of lives lost of Americans in Afghanistan from our military have occurred under Commander Obama. 84% of all of the wounded have been wounded under the command of Commander Obama. It's time to talk about these things, whether the presidential candidates want to talk about them or not. We owe that to the people we have put in harm's way. As this is the anniversary of 9/11, it's another opportunity for me to recall the memory of Ross McGinnis. Hadn't gotten an email from Tom asking me not to forget. He knows I will never forget his son. But I went to his funeral at Arlington National Cemetery. I've had become friends since then with the McGinnises. I've been to all the funerals of those who have died while in service in harm's way from my district, and I've been to too many of those such funerals. But this wasn't a person from my district in East Texas. It's a guy from Knox, Pennsylvania, a young man, graduated from high school, gotten into trouble at the end. Ross's mom doesn't want me to forget that. But he was given a second chance. They let him graduate. He joined the Army, and Ross found his niche. I haven't seen any pictures anybody had of me during Army basic training or officer basic training in Fort Riley, Kansas in 1974. But I don't think I was smiling if somebody has them. It was a difficult time. It was hot, humid. But there are pictures of Ross going through basic with other soldiers, and he got a big old smile. He had a beautiful smile. And the guys with him are not so smiling. There are pictures of him after he got to Iraq, and the heat obviously was wearing down his friends, fellow service members, but he had a big old grin. His platoon sergeant told me that he was such a piece of enthusiasm in their midst. He was uplifting to the other soldiers. And Ross was a gunner on a Humvee, and as it was going through a town, whether shot or thrown, a grenade goes into the bed of the Humvee where there were 4 of our soldiers, including Ross's platoon sergeant from Longview, Texas, Cedric Thomas, a soldier from Tyler, my hometown, Sean Lawson, 2 other soldiers. And they said that Ross yelled grenade, and he looked back, but Ross was the only one in a position to jump out and save himself. But when he looked back and he saw each of the 4 cringing in their corners, he obviously knew those 4 soldiers were going to die. So instead of jumping out and saving his own life and 4 soldiers being lost, he didn't jump out. He jumped in, covered the grenade, took the full blow himself, gave his life, and 4 of our soldiers are alive today because of what Ross did. Just as on the statue downstairs right below me, right below where I stand, the statue of Father Damien, Catholic priest from Hawaii. On the side of it is John 15:13. The words, "Greater love hath no one than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." Ross had a lot of love. The accounts after 9/11, after those planes flew into the buildings, here at the Pentagon, there in New York, those incredible heroes on the 4th flight that went down in a field in Pennsylvania, those heroes went running in, willing to lay down their lives to save others, as Ross did. There at Arlington National Cemetery, the Army chaplain did a wonderful job. Taps was played. It always gets me. I got everybody there. 21 gun salute is an emotional thing at a funeral. And as everyone stood to turn to go, Sergeant Thomas came up, knelt down before the remains of Ross, put his hand on the remains of Ross McGinnis, bowed his head in prayer. He was followed by 2 others that Ross had saved. The 4th was still in Iraq. They put their hands on Ross's remains, bowed, took a knee, bowed in prayer. And it was obvious what they were doing. Whether it's on Memorial Day, Veterans Day, 9/11 anniversary, there cannot be too many occasions when we as a nation stop and do what those 3 soldiers did. Thank those who have laid down their lives for the rest of us, for our liberties. Thank those who have sacrificed life or limb or suffered terrible disability for us and our lives and our liberty. And then to thank God for people who are still willing to lay down their lives for us. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announcement,